This episode is sponsored by the Hollywood Casino at Charlestown Races in West Virginia. Hollywood Casino and ESPN Bet want to help you get ready for football season. Download the ESPN Bet app today and explore an action-packed online sports book. Then stop in the casino to catch the action in person with a tailgate party on November 17th. Visit HollywoodCasinoCharlestown.com to see how you can reserve your package. Must be 21 to enter the casino floor. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Welcome to the newest episode of Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. I'm your host, Jason Fraley, picking the brains of the top filmmakers, musicians, and artists of our time. Tomorrow is Election Day here in the United States of America, so today we welcome back former Kennedy Center Board Chairman David Rubenstein to discuss his new book, The Highest Calling, in which he interviews former presidents like Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, as well as outgoing sitting President Joe Biden, who's being replaced on the ballot by Vice President Kamala Harris. Hey, Mr. Rubenstein. Hello. Hey, thanks so much for joining us in D.C. again.
My pleasure.
We are talking to the former Kennedy Center Board Chairman and the co-founder of the Carlyle Group and the current owner of our favorite Baltimore Orioles. You and I spoke, I guess for the History with David Rubenstein PBS series a couple years ago, but this time we're talking about your new book, The Highest Calling, where you interview not only historians, but actual living presidents. So before we get to those, just the general concept of the book, why was now the time to do it? It's an election year. It's just the perfect timing, right?
Well, it takes a while to get these books done, so I can't say I exquisitely timed it that well, but it worked out okay. Look, we have a presidential election coming up in which 160 million Americans will vote, but 80 million Americans who are eligible to vote will not likely vote. And so what I want people to do is to read about the presidents, get excited about the presidential elections, and actually get informed and actually vote. I think our democracy would be stronger if we had a larger percentage of people eligible to vote actually voting.
Oh, I agree entirely. Well, I want to get to, I'm so fascinated to hear about, some takeaways from the living presidents that you actually sat down and interviewed. But before we get to that, talk about the past presidents, the ones, from the history books that are no longer with us. What did you learn from historians about some of the famous figures, the Lincolns, the Washingtons, the Roosevelts, which ones do you actually go into in the book?
Well, I've covered many of them. Lincoln, for example, is the president I most admire, because he basically won the Civil War despite the great odds against him. He freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation, but he did it with humility. He didn't brag about that I was president of the United States. He didn't tell people how great he was because he won the Civil War. Also, was extremely literate. Although not educated, he wrote some of the greatest pieces about our country's history ever, what his country's all about, the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural Address. So Lincoln, you have to admire him. And it's sad that we didn't have him live to see the Reconstruction through that he wanted to have. Had he lived, I think Reconstruction would have worked much better, and I think the South and the North would have been reunited in a much better way than actually was the case, because his successor, Andrew Johnson, was not really in favor of what Lincoln had wanted to do with respect to Reconstruction. Washington was a person who set the tone. And Washington did not want it to be a kind of a aristocratic kind of presidency. Country would have gone along with that, but he didn't want any of his heirs to succeed him. He didn't really want to be president for very long. He set the tone of calling the president Mr. President as opposed to Your Excellency or Your Highness. He also really traveled throughout the country, which is an example that other presidents have now done. He went around the country to make sure he understood what people had on their minds, and that's a tradition that we keep up with even today, of course.
Absolutely. Well, folks, you'll hear all these historic presidents, talked about by historians in this book. But in terms of the living presidents, what did you learn from interviewing? I'll try to maybe pair them together. How about compare Bill Clinton and George W. Bush? Compare interviewing both of those two.
Well, I've interviewed them together, actually. They both have a very good relationship, but they're different in many ways. George Bush was not as interested in the details of policy as maybe Bill Clinton was. George Bush brought a kind of Texas mindset, a kind of a not Eastern establishment mindset to the presidency. Although Bill Clinton was from Arkansas, he was educated in the East, and I think he had more of a Eastern mindset in some respects. And his wife, who was a very important partner to him, had that mindset as well. But both of them were extremely talented at what they had to do. George Bush today is largely retired from politics. He's spending time on his library, his painting, and some public speeches from time to time. Bill Clinton is still involved in presidential campaigning, and he just spoke at the Democratic convention. Still very involved in public policy, as his wife is. So they're different personalities, but they get along reasonably well.
And when you're saying George Bush, we're talking W, of course, because the senior is passed.
Correct.
But
I did know George Herbert Walker Bush pretty well too, but he lived to be 94 years old, and he spent a large part of his post-presidency in doing things that I was involved with, so I got to know him pretty well.
Well, as we're speaking, it's the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. Did you go into that with either Clinton or Bush? Because I know the first, the first World Trade Center bombing was during Clinton, and a lot of the Bin Laden rise and all that. But and then Bush, gosh, you're a baseball owner. He came out and threw that strike at the Yankee Stadium. I will never forget it. But yeah, like just through the lens of 9/11, did that come up at all with either Clinton or Bush? Your conversations?
Well, not directly, but Bush did address it, and obviously he had to learn very quickly on the job. He's only in the job for about 9 months before 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden he had to become a global leader and actually take us to war. And so that hadn't happened before under Bush, and he didn't have a lot of experience in that kind of thing. He wasn't a very foreign policy experienced person, but nonetheless he rose to the occasion, and I think deserves a lot of credit for getting the country and the world together to kind of fight back into Al Qaeda. It took a long time, though, to capture Osama bin Laden. I think we could have maybe done things differently, but we did eventually get him under President Obama.
And Barack Obama, not interviewed in this book, correct? You weren't able to get him for a sit down, right?
I've interviewed him before, but not in this book. I interviewed a person who had written a book about him.
Gotcha. So he's definitely obviously featured in this book.
Sure.
I was curious, did W, yes, we got bin Laden eventually under Obama, and Bush, like I said, rallied the country right after 9/11. But did he express any regret to you about, the whole Iraq war diversion, maybe taking our eye off the ball and going in to get Saddam rather than just sticking in Afghanistan? Or I don't know. What is your take? What did he say to you?
I did ask him whether if we had known there were no weapons of mass destruction, would he still have gone into Iraq? And I think he said pretty much that I probably would not have gone in had I known there were no weapons of mass destruction, but our intelligence told us that there was. And therefore, I think he doesn't regret having gone in because he thinks in the end, Iraq is better off without Saddam Hussein. But had he known for certain there were no weapons of mass destruction, I don't think he could have gotten the political support to go in. And I don't think he would have gone in.
Gotcha. All right. Well, how about even more recently? You actually did interviews with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I mean, those are two, I guess depending what party you're in, are divisive names nowadays. But even in the last months alone with the two of them, we've seen a historic shift here with Kamala Harris coming in, and it's incredible. But for those of us that see them on TV or social media, God forbid, what did you learn from sitting down with them as people?
Well, I've known Joe Biden for a long time, and so I've had a good relationship with him. I've seen him on many occasions over the years as a president. I had an hour alone with him in the Oval Office, no staff, just he and I went through, what his life a bit was and what he liked being president, what he was disappointed about. And so I think at the time he thought he would be running again, and that obviously the events have changed. I've known Donald Trump for a long time as well. I got an interview with him for about an hour before a trial one day that he was in New York for. And there's different personalities, completely oil and water in many respects. But they both have, a certain enormous drive, and they both have their unique qualities. Donald Trump is a unique personality for sure. He'll be the Republican nominee for 3 straight terms, and that's very unusual. Joe Biden is a person who spent more time trying to become president than anybody in our country's history. For 47 years of his life, he was talked about as a potential president before he actually was elected president. That's a long time. I think he wished he would have served a second term. I interviewed him before we knew he wasn't going to serve a second term, but I expect to see him over this weekend actually, and I see him for an event. And I suspect he's now looking towards his post-presidency, but he wants to get a lot of things done before he leaves office, as many presidents do when they not going to be president any longer. They tend to want to get things done because they have a legacy they want to live up to. And I think Joe Biden is now keeping his staff very busy trying to get things done that he might have thought he would do in the next term.
Did you ask Donald or Joe about January 6th? I mean, I feel like that event came very close to no peaceful transfer of power, like Washington, the first president highlighted in your book.
I would say that Donald Trump's views on January 6th are pretty much what he said to other people. His view was that he asked people to march up the Capitol Hill patriotically and peacefully, but in the end, we saw what happened. I don't think he accepts the blame for it. Obviously, he's been indicted for it. That trial is yet to be, go forward. So I think the consequences of what happened on January 6th are still likely to be part of our system for a while, because that trial will occur most likely at some point next year. With respect to Joe Biden, he obviously was, like many Democrats at the time and other Republicans, upset with what happened, and I think he felt that it was a terrible failure on Donald Trump's part to have allowed something like that to happen. But you're not going to convince Donald Trump that he's responsible for something that happened on January 6th. You're never going to convince him of that, and you're not going to convince Joe Biden that Donald Trump wasn't responsible for it. So it's they have different views on those things. But I was interested to see they were next to each other for the first time in a long time, where they went at the 9/11 memorial, and I guess they shook hands, but they don't really have a big relationship, obviously.
Unfortunately, Mr. Rubenstein had to bounce before we could discuss the Baltimore Orioles, but here's what he had to say after losing in the wild card round of the playoffs, a game I attended, by the way. Here's the statement Rubenstein issued with his fellow co-owners, quote, "We are sorry the Orioles did not go as far into the playoffs as we had all hoped. Baseball can be very unpredictable, and we share in your disappointment. This season, we celebrated victories that extend beyond the scoreboard, as we secured another consecutive postseason berth and welcomed more fans to Oriole Park and downtown Baltimore. Our community rallied behind us. We thank you for all of your support and encouragement, without which the Orioles could not have done as well as we did. As we close out this season, we're already looking ahead to the next stage of our journey. With each achievement, we have built momentum for what lies ahead, and we're ready to turn the page to the next chapter, one that promises even more Orioles magic." Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. Our theme music is Scott Buckley's Clarion. Remember to give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. We'll see you next time.